Party people, Tony Rowe here, coming at you with a new instructional video. This, in my opinion, is the number one positional mistake, okay, that club players make on a regular basis. Pretty much every game, I would say. Most of the time, multiple times per game. It's a broad concept. It's not granular, but I hope that by the time you're done watching this video that you understand that tension in chess pops up so much, and understanding the idea of building tension and forcing your opponent to resolve the tension to your advantage is huge, okay? And yes, I do realize that my mic is in the shot. I got a new mic, and it's so ridiculous that I just thought I had to, like, kind of show it off. Why does it glow? I don't know, but I like it. Okay. So first, let's talk about what tension is and why I think club players tend to resolve it too soon. Okay, so tension, I would say, is kind of a state between two pieces where one or usually both can capture each other. Okay, and the most common example would be pawn tension, especially in the center, is when it normally happens. But also rooks or other heavy pieces like queens along an open file, or even pins. So in a pin, it's a little weird to call it tension because the pinned piece cannot capture the pinner, but because usually the person who has the pinned piece has the option to break the pin in some way, I consider the tension between leaving the pin and breaking the pin, and also, you know, capturing the pin piece or leaving the pin piece there, to be an element of tension. Okay, and good players tend to build upon tension, right? Like, consider just very simply the Queen's Gambit, d4, d5, c4. Good players tend to defend the pawn with c6 or e6, usually. No offense to the Queen's Gambit accepted, totally reasonable move. But in general, people defend pawns in the center, and they build tension around them. And both players, like white, will then play 3 knight c3, knight f6, knight f3, and then later white goes bishop g5, pinning the defender of the d-pawn. The whole goal in most classical openings is to build central tension to the point where usually black cannot hold it any longer and is forced to relieve the tension. Okay, and that could be just as simple as d takes c4 when white has an extra pawn in the center. But that's a tiny victory that white has won, okay? Club player, I really mean like lower rated players. I say club players, I'm still a club player, but what I really mean is lower rated players tend to release the tension because they don't understand that there's a positional transaction that goes on with every capture. So just like in chess, where like even relatively new players know pawn is 1 point, or pawn is 1 pawn, knight is 3 pawns, bishop is 3 pawns, maybe slightly more than 3 pawns, rook is 5 pawns. People don't understand that besides material transactions, every capture is a positional transaction. So every time there's pawn tension and you choose to push past, that has positional consequences. Every time there's pawn tension, you capture, that has positional consequences. And whether or not you understand and can evaluate the positions post-releasing the tension, that's what determines really how good you act in these positions under tension, okay? So you always want to build, and if you evaluate the release as favorable, then you can release. But if the release does not specifically give you some benefit, some transaction, if you're not making, you know, a quarter of a point or, you know, a tenth of a point off that release, and you think you should leave it, well, you think you can leave it, you should leave it, okay? And I've got a bunch of examples. The first one is obviously very simple. Yeah, just consider the following position, okay? The rooks are in tension along the d file, okay? And of course, like if it's white's to move, I just made this position up, but it's white's to move. If white were to take this, okay, after rook takes d8, black controls the d file, and there's no way for, let's make that red because it's terrible for white. And really, let's pretend like we're gonna go to the right square. So, and now there's no way for white to contest the only open file, and probably he can't stop black from winning at least a pawn after rook d2, because the rook will not be able to guard both, and the king is not in time to guard this one. Okay, so the most simple example, and they get complex, of course. Okay, so second sort of similar example. I'm trying to build up in complexity here, so I'm starting with some more simple examples, and we'll go to stuff that's more complicated. The Scotch game. Okay, after e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, d4. White immediately builds tension between these two pawns. Okay, and black can capture or black can leave it. And pretty much universally, black chooses to capture here. And it's a funny second example because you're like, Tony, you just told me to stop releasing tension as often as I am. And then the second example, black releases tension. But the point is, what other options does he have? As far as bolstering the pawn goes, there's really just d6. And after, let's say, bishop b5, you have a Steinitz-Roy Lopez, which is not particularly exciting for black. And usually black is forced to play e takes d4 in those positions anyway. I think normally it's bishop d7, but after like natural moves like knight c3, it actually turns out it's pretty hard for black to avoid this for lengthy periods of time, because eventually bishop takes c6, bishop takes c6, d takes e5 becomes a threat, and then and of course f6 is even worse. F6 is completely hideous. Yeah, wouldn't be able to develop the knight here. There's problems here. Yeah, real sad. And the other, and of course, white even retains the option of going like d5 when black has to lose a knight, moving the knight, and then maybe white can even expand further in the center with c4, and you get some kind of like weird King's Indian sort of structure where white is probably similarly better. The other thing about releasing the tension in this specific situation is that even though it results in a favorable structure for white, and actually let me just clarify that. So part of the problem here is that for black, if you look at this structure, this is just slightly better for white. Okay, white has the only center pawn on the 4th rank, and traditionally it's going to be very hard for black to get d5 in. Okay, and so black runs into kind of this situation where he has less central space and even has to watch out for white pushing for more. If you can imagine if a knight hits f6 and then white gets to go e5. White controls more space, and that usually means that white's pieces will find slightly better squares. You could imagine later in the game, white will go f4 and create even more space, e5 again. And so those positions long-term can be somewhat tricky for black to manage. The good thing for black in this case is that even though e takes d4 centralizes white's knight, it's better on d4 than it is on f3, for instance. It's black's move. So this transaction with d4 lost time for white, okay? Because in this position, it's white's move, and he could choose to go bishop c4, bishop b5, and develop a piece. Instead, he goes d4, and black exchanges to not lose time or make any other positional concessions, and it's now his turn. So people familiar with Scotch game theory know that black usually develops some piece to start some initiative against this unstable knight on d4 or the pawn on e4, etc. So that's one of the reasons why the Scotch game is not just like clearly better for white, is white loses a little bit of time, and black, in exchange for releasing the tension in the center and giving white a somewhat favorable structure, centralizing his knight, black gets the initiative. Now, what you don't play here, but what you see a lot of club players play here, is further releasing the tension with knight takes d4. This is the exact opposite situation of black playing e takes d4 the move before. So in this case, black exchanges and develops white's queen for free and leaves the position even worse than it was a move previous, with white having 2 free moves and the same good structure before. Black usually goes queen f6. You see this a lot in like club games, this like weird exchange Scotch. And tell you what white doesn't play right away, at least, is queen takes f6, releasing the tension between these two queens, because then it would again lose time. Black would capture with the knight, and he would have a slight lead in development. Okay, white usually goes e5, and after queen b6, the situation is a little bit different. Now queen takes b6 does not gain black any time for development, and it's white's turn again. And after knight c3, we have a similar situation where white is up a half move. He's threatening knight d5, and he's got this pawn on e5 instead of e4. So white is pretty indisputably better here. And again, you can kind of compare this with, let's say, just like a normal move on move 4, something like this. You can clearly see between this position, okay, for instance, which is just standard Scotch theory, and two pieces developed on well-centralized squares. White kind of has to react now versus this, where white has this pawn on e5 for free, knight on c3, and it has the initiative with knight b3 or knight d5. You can clearly tell that black releasing the tension in this case has led to positional concessions. Another example. Why are these all starting at the end? Dang it. Spoiling everything. Okay. Yeah, another example in the Nimzo Indian. This is an example of like a pin or a couple pins where you're talking about tension. So there's sort of tension between this bishop on c3 and this bishop on b4 and this knight on c3 in the Nimzo Indian. Usually you'll see black wait until white forces black to clarify the pin. You rarely see people just smack this immediately unless it forces a clear concession from white. So typically, this is the classical variation with queen c2. Basically, white wants to force black to take and then take with the queen so he doesn't get the doubled pawns. Castles, a3. In this case, black cannot keep the tension between these pinned pieces because b4, bishop b6, c5 would trap the bishop. It doesn't make a lot of sense for black to retreat because it would just be giving white a3 for free. And the bishop isn't very good on e7, obviously. So black pretty much has to take. And after b6, white wants to go e3 and develop his kingside, bishop d3, knight e2 or knight f3, but he gets the bishop out first. Bishop b7, and f3, for instance, similar position can happen after e3. And now black goes h6. And again, there's this tension in this pin. White can go bishop h4, white can go bishop f6, or white can go like bishop h4, bishop f6, or like some weird move like bishop f4, for instance. Not a single time has white ever released the tension. In the 1,261 games in the Elite Chess Masters database, white has never played bishop takes f6. Giving back the bishop pair, developing black's queen for free. And after bishop h4, keeping the tension, we can clearly see the idea, right? Like, black has given up the dark squared bishop, which makes this pin very hard to break. And now that black's king is castled on the king side, g5 becomes very risky, okay? Playing h6, g5 when your king's over there is obviously quite risky. And this is the entire point of tension in chess, is like, you build upon it because your opponent releasing it is a concession. If it's not a concession when he releases it, he's probably going to release it. But if it is a concession for your opponent to release it, then you build upon it. Okay, you don't just like snap everything off that you can, because again, you need, the tough thing about tension in chess is like it requires experience and positional understanding and chess knowledge to evaluate, like, okay, if I go bishop h4 and I is it better for me to go bishop h4 or is it better for me to go bishop f6? You have to be able to evaluate the resulting positions, which of course comes with time and experience. But the point is that you should be thinking about every capture and release of tension as a positional transaction. Okay. Okay, similar sort of structure to the Scotch one, slightly different, and this is a similar structure to even the Roy Lopez or the King's Indian in a way, and as we'll see in a second. But after e4, e5, knight f3, d6, this is the Philidor, and again, white should go d4 and immediately introduce this tension in the center. And the point is that we reach a structure that looks like this, okay, where e takes d4, knight takes d4 in this case would yield a very similar structure to the Scotch structure. where white has the pawn on e4 versus the pawn that's slightly shorter, slightly held back on d6, and those positions tend to be better for white. And so in the Philidor defense, the entire point is to bolster that e5 pawn until, and organize your pieces behind that e5 pawn until the time is right to liquidate it in the center. Usually that would mean, for instance, black has organized enough pressure against this e4 pawn that after ed, knight d, like pressure along the e file combined with like knight d7 to c5 with the knight on f6 means that black can expose this weakness on e4 that's maybe pushed a little too far forward. The other option would be that like black typically might release here if he can go d5 and completely liquidate that tiny advantage that white has in the central space arena. And you see that over and over again in the open games, is like if black gets d5 in, he's equal or better. And it's the same in the open Sicilian, where instead of like this e pawn being missing after ed, it would be back here and the pawn on c5 would be missing. Same thing. If black gets in, black usually has less space in the Sicilian. It's usually like this e pawn versus this d pawn, same as here. But same thing. If black gets d5 in, black is usually better in the Sicilian because he still has the e pawn left. He has one extra pawn in the center, but same thing. And so what you'll see in the Philidor, like theory-wise, is that black is trying to find ways to keep the pawn on e5, and it's actually really hard, which is one of the reasons why people don't typically play the Philidor much anymore. For instance, knight d7, knight c6 would be pretty much the same thing we already looked at in the Scotch, bishop b5, and it's very hard for black to keep this. D5 would be a threat, and bishop d7 again would be like that Steinitz Roy Lopez. So black in this case has knight d7 as an option. Now bishop b5 c6 would be no good for white. Bishop c4, and it becomes slightly difficult for black to develop his king side. For instance, bishop e7. Knight f6 is hard because of knight g5 stuff, either before or after d takes e5. But like bishop e7, getting ready to meet knight g5 stuff with castles after knight f6. White can go takes. And on d takes e5, there's queen d5 check, and you lose, or queen d5, you lose immediately. Knight h6, bishop takes h6, followed by queen takes f7. Very sad. So after bishop e7, d takes, black has to take with the knight. Knight takes e5, d takes e5, queen h5 wins at least this pawn on e5 because of this double threat. So black goes c6 instead. At the very least, stopping queen d5 later. And after castles, again, knight g to f6 doesn't work because of this. For instance, either knight takes e5, takes, bishop f7 with a pretty brutal deflection. Or knight g to f6, d takes e5, d takes e5, in which case knight g5, and you can't actually protect f7 anymore. So black again has to go bishop e7, and then white chooses to release the tension. This is the key kind of thing about this example, is like black doesn't want to, because it yields that space in the center, and typically white wouldn't want to because it yields this very symmetrical e-pawn versus e-pawn structure, which shouldn't be better for white at all, sort of in a vacuum. Like if everything else was equal, this structure is just completely symmetrical with equal space in the center. White generally wouldn't want that, except for the fact that in this specific case, there are tactical reasons why he can. So for here, d takes e5, d takes e5, knight g5, excuse me, exclam, hitting f7, bishop takes, queen h5 with this mate, and g5 double attack. And white just pretty much has the two bishops for free and is much better. Okay, but again, the point is like, after e4, e5, knight f3, d6, d4, both players are struggling around this like sort of anchor on e5. If white just exchanges for no reason, you get a completely symmetrical structure, which isn't good. If black exchanges, there's like this small concession in the center, and so both players are trying to build up tension or find ways to release the tension in their favor. Okay, and actually, these lines are one of the reasons why Philidor players a lot of times start with d6, because which would like be a Peert's move order. Because after knight f6, hitting the e pawn, knight c3, black can go e5, and after knight f3, knight b to d7. The insertion of knight f6 and knight c3 favors black. After bishop c4, black can just go bishop e7, and he's in time for all this knight g5 shenanigans with just castles. And so what you usually get is a position like this. And again, black is going to make a bunch of these moves behind the c5 pawn, refusing to release the pressure. Something like this, maybe bishop f8, g6, bishop g7. And we're going to get something that looks kind of like a closed Roy Lopez. And if black releases the tension, it'll be because he's ready to either bust out with like b5, c5, or e takes d4, knight takes d4, like with rook e8 and the e pawn is under attack, bishop b7, knight c5, that kind of stuff. So very solid. Very similar. Not all my examples are opening examples, by the way, but it's just easy. It's easiest to illustrate a lot of these concepts in the opening because there's a lot of central tension with pawns. Very similar example in the classical King's Indian, okay? With the pawn on c4 instead of c3, it can be a little bit harder for white to bolster it, right? Like in the Roy Lopez, you'd expect white to go like c3, d4, but here in the King's Indian, he can't. But there's an interesting moment here on move 7 where like black has 3 knight moves, and against only one of them will white release the tension. So there's like the classic Mar del Plata variation with knight c6 when first of all there's just more tension on d4, which can be hard for white to deal with, but also after d5, knight e7, this knight on e7 is actually very poorly placed in the resulting King's Indian positions. And so white is happy to close the game and go into like this mutual queenside versus kingside attack thing because at this exact moment he was able to force black's knight to this crappy e7 square. Play usually continues like knight e1, knight d7, knight d3, f5. And again, there's kind of this interesting moment where people might expect f3, but usually white goes bishop d2 first. Keeping the tension. The point is that if black closes the game right away with something like f4, then white can take this opportunity to go bishop g4. And, any eventual knight to f6 allows bishop takes c8, trading off white's bad bishop for black's good bishop. And black will find it very hard to break through on the king side without the light square bishop in the King's Indian. So usually, let me clean that up in my study a little bit. Usually black must go knight f6, again, building up against this mutual tension in the center, and kind of forcing f3, after which now black goes f4 because bishop g4 is no longer an option. Okay, but against other 7th moves, white can and should be a little bit more reluctant to release the tension. First of all, there's knight a6, which looks like kind of a weird move, like why is the knight on the edge? But the point is like after d5, knight c5 is an amazing square. So white typically will not go d5 here because knight c5 and the knight is much better placed here than on e7, for instance. So you'll see other moves instead, like bishop e3 or rook e1. And again, black will probably make useful sort of quasi-waiting moves, building up behind this e5 pawn until he's ready to go e takes d4 and start hopping knight c5, pressuring the e4 pawn, etc. Another really popular line nowadays is knight b to d7, which has the same idea, like d5, of course, knight c5. But yeah, I mean, in this specific case, again, you'll see the same moves for white, bishop e3, rook e1, refusing to release the tension because at least at the moment, it's to black's advantage. And again, d takes e5, d takes e5, like this actually, typically these structures are usually a little bit favorable for black in a way, because after c6, because white's played c4, e4, this d4 square is always going to be black's. But the same cannot be true, cannot be said for the d5 square. Black has c6, which makes it very hard for white later in the game usually. So as far as releasing the tension goes, it's really d5 or nothing. And again, like these structures after, let's say, like bishop e3, e takes d4, which would probably be a positional mistake. Yeah, and after knight takes d4, black only wins 16% of games in this position. So yeah, pretty unpleasant. The point is like this structure is very pleasant for white, who has much more space in the center. And so if black has no concrete way to bust out or trade off a bunch of pieces, so the space advantage is not as significant, he'll suffer here, because again, white will slowly use that extra space to put his pieces on better squares and then probably break through to much to black's sadness. But yeah, again, the point is, like in this position, play typically goes something like bishop e3, and then Gowan Jones has been popularizing queen e7, trying to build up pressure against this e4 pawn to force white to go d5 in the most favorable way possible. And again, usually white refuses with queen c2, just protecting the e4 pawn, getting his queen off the back rank. Black goes c6, just a useful waiting move. Rook a to d1, and h6. So black is getting ready to go knight g4, essentially, when bishop g5 is no longer possible. Also, in some positions, black goes knight h7, either to g5 or just getting ready for the f5 break if white closes the center. And after rook f to e1, white has actually waited one move too long. People usually either go h3 or d5 here. But the point is like now, again, this is like where the battle of ideas and the calculation, the positional judgment comes in. In this specific moment, black can open up the center with knight g4, threatening to just lop off this bishop, grab the two bishops. White does not oblige. E takes d4, knight takes d4, and then there's this really nice tactic, knight f2. I couldn't resist using this example because it's just so pretty. Point being is that after king takes f2, queen takes h4, or queen to h4 check, if like king g1, for instance, there's bishop takes d4 check, rook takes d4, queen takes e1. So white could try king e3, for instance, protecting the bishop. But after bishop takes d4, again, taking with the rook allows queen to h1, so white has to take with the king. Queen to f2 check, bishop e3, c5, king d3, knight e5 check, king d2, knight takes c4, exploiting this pin and losing the bishop on e3. White is completely lost. But yeah, again, that's the point, is like both players in these games where tension is involved are going to build around that, try and build up into that tension, and then release it when they deem it favorable for them. Okay, yeah, let's see, this video is going kind of long. I'm going to skip this example. I'm going to go on to example 7. All this stuff, I'll post the link to the study down below there. You'll be able to check out all the examples. Again, follow along with the video if you want. A couple examples of maybe more middle game ideas, but again, there are so many. Tension just pervades chess that like on almost every move you can look at chess from like a tension perspective. Okay, so like e4, d4, e4, e6, d4, d5, the French defense, okay, is another great example. By the way, like tension is one of the main reasons why like the exchange French and the exchange Caro are not considered to be all of that critical. Like, again, similar to the Philidor example, if white were to go d4 takes e5, like e takes d5 results in a completely symmetrical structure with equal amounts of space. Whereas, at least in this example, white can hope to build up tension and force like a capture on e4, or force through e5 under more favorable circumstances, okay, where he'd have more space in the center to try and claim some sort of long-term positional edge, okay? But like, exchanging releases the tension immediately for no apparent gain. White is still up a half move. It's his turn, but structurally he's fixed the position in a equal way. That's why you typically would see like knight c3 here be the main move. Okay. And I actually, this is kind of a funny story. I think I've mentioned on the channel before that Georg Meyer has been a coach of mine. I haven't been taking lessons recently, but for a while I was taking lessons relatively consistently with Georg a couple years ago. And one of the things about Georg, he's like the world's foremost expert on d takes e4 here, which is called the Rubinstein variation of the French. And you know, he was talking about like, okay, why would black want to release the tension in the center like this? A lot of very strong grandmasters would consider this a positional concession. And he asked me, do you think that, for instance, the classical main line with knight f6, e5, knight f to d7 is less of a concession, basically allowing the pawn e5 to hit e5 with a bigger space advantage and forcing this knight to d7, which arguably is not a particularly great square, similar to the knight c6 to e7 in the Mar del Plata? Or do you think like the win hour, which is the other main idea here for black, again, allowing e5, c5, a3, but this is all the main line, giving up the two bishops, weakening black's dark squares, and allowing the pawn on e5. Do you find these to be smaller concessions? So he was arguing that essentially the two main lines of the French were larger positional concessions than simply releasing the tension with d takes e4. And this is a good example of like, again, you're going to release the tension if you can then later force some liquidation of like this and this, or maybe this for this. And this is the entire strategical goal of the French Rubinstein, is like after these moves, black is going to go here, try and play c takes d4, eliminating white's space advantage and leaving black with the only center pawn. Then black can, you know, go long-term e5, f5, build up in the center. But yeah, again, after these moves, black introduces some central tension between these knights, and white has a major choice of leaving the tension with bishop d3, which is considered to be the best move nowadays, or just taking right away. Tons and tons and tons of people in my online games go knight g3, which is dubious. And hopefully by now you guys might understand why. White releases the tension between these knights while hurting the position of his knight on e4 and losing time. Okay, so like this move just not good. And after c5, black is, you know, I would say equal, and statistically scores about, yeah, equal, even better than white in a lot of lines with bishop b takes c5 or bishop d3. Black is scoring better, so understandable. A lot of historically the main line has just been to lop these things off and then, you know, keep this half tempo development advantage with bishop d3. Black again introduces more pawn tension in the center, and again this is a case where specifically it is possible for white to go bishop e3 and leave the tension, and this actually is a good move. And again, black does not go after bishop e3. Black does not release the tension back, helping to bring white's bishop to a better centralized square. He leaves the tension while developing his own piece with queen c7. Again, so you see like this interplay and like of tension in the center where both people are not willing to budge and help the position of each other's pieces. You know, but it is kind of tricky, like, to deal with the tension in this position in other ways, like for instance castles, because c takes d4, even though knight takes d4 is possible because of queen d4, bishop b5 check, picking up the queen. Eventually, white will have to make some concession with this knight. Like, you know, knight b3 is the most popular move, and then after bishop d6, most white players, I think, argue that like this position is worse for white than if you just allowed this position. They'd rather have the white knight on the f3 square than on the b3 square. So they release the tension to keep it there, essentially. Castles, castles. Bishop g5. And again, black can can at least poke at this tension with h6 just to find out if white's going to move it. White's going to go bishop h4, etc. But the main move is b6, queen e2, bishop b7, rook a to d1, queen c7. It is possible to go queen e7 for those who are wondering, but people have figured out that allowing this fracture of black's kingside is okay. Again, this is an example of white has chosen to release the tension between these two pieces because he's happy to trade the two bishops for this fractured pawn structure on the king side. Again, tension, bishop e4. So there's this mutual sort of opportunity to capture, and to a certain extent, both players leave it because they argue that, number one, if bishop takes b7, queen takes b7, black would be happier with the queen on b7 than on c7. And similarly, black is going to typically be very reluctant to capture here because it centralizes white's queen, which makes it easier for white to shoot this queen over to one of these three squares on the queen side, whereas e2 is not very active. So black typically goes rook f to d8, and then after knight d2, because of the threat of queen g4 and possibly the knight capturing on the e4 square, or bishop takes b7, queen takes b7, knight e4, hitting this thing and this thing, black typically forces the issue now, and white has to take it. This way, knight e4 and queen g4 are both not possible. King h1, bishop d4, both getting ready to guard the king side and probing white's king side a little bit, queen side, excuse me. F4, and now black begins kind of like this very sort of clever maneuver to build up tension along the d file to eventually win the only fully open file on the board. So take a second if you want, use it as an exercise, see what you come up with. Okay, so in this specific position, black goes rook d5, exclam, and after knight f3, rook a to d8, white found it hard to deal with the pressure along the d file. The point of rook d5 versus the point of rook d7, for instance, I'm sure many of you thought, okay, just rook d7 double. The advantage of doing this is actually that black can triple on the d file. And again, black has built up enough tension along the d line that white either moves, like rook c1, rook e1, which is kind of cowardly and sad, when black dominates the d file, or he exchanges when, again, still black dominates the d file, but now instead of the b7 square, black has forced white via tension to capture on d5 and put his queen into this dominant central square. Again, a2 is hit. Yeah, and black dominates the d file. So a really clever example, a really great line overall for examining tension in chess and all these little micro transactions, but also this clever idea with rook d5. Not the only time Georg has used rook d5, by the way. There was another game. These were both from 2002, so Georg was probably under 16 at the time and maybe 2200, but yeah, there was another game where, let's see, after rook d8, white just captured immediately, bishop takes b7, queen takes b7, with the idea of going queen c4. Again, this idea of putting the queen along the fourth rank. Bishop f8, getting ready to defend all these weaknesses with bishop g7, c3, bishop g7, queen f4, and now, you guessed it, rook d5. And again, this was Anderson, Meyer, Hallsberg Open 2002, and Anderson chose to just go rook d5, queen d5. Again, with this same problem that black now controls the only open file on the board, and a2 is weak. It is possible in this position specifically that white could kind of try and do the same thing to black and maintain the tension with rook d2. So again, looking to build up along the d file and not concede the open file. This would be about equal. But yeah, I hope I have a couple more examples in the Roy Lopez example number 6 for you guys checking out the study. I did not put it in this thing because we're at 40 minutes or something already, and I was hoping to keep this video to 20 minutes. But if you made it this far, yeah, I hope this really clarifies the idea of what tension is in chess and why good players seek to build tension and force you to resolve it versus the opposite, which is like what it's kind of like, the old chess saying Patzer sees check, Patzer plays check, right? It's like this is like the positional version where it's like Patzer sees tension, Patzer resolves tension. Doesn't roll off the tongue, does it? But I forgot to tell this story at the starting of the video, but a good example of just like when I was coming up, I was maybe, I don't know, 1800. There was a store at my local mall. So I grew up in North Olmsted, Ohio, which is like a suburb of Cleveland, and there was a store in the North Olmsted Mall called the House of Chess, and the House of Chess owner had like an agreement with many-time U.S. champion Alexander Shabalov, which if you don't know who this guy is, that's who he is. You see what I did there? Always impeccably dressed, by the way. Look at that cool Paisley shirt, man. But yeah, so he had the owner had an agreement with Shabalov, and Shabalov would come like every Wednesday or something and do like a free lecture and a simul. And because, as one might expect, the store was not popular at all. It's a chess store in a mall. It's just a ridiculous concept. So like sometimes there'd be like 3 people there for these lectures and simuls. And so basically you'd get to just play like a game against Shabalov, sometimes multiple. Like if you crush you just set up another one and play. But I remember like after the first couple, I was like 1800 at the time, and my buddy was a national master, and I remember we both walked out of there after having just been like absolutely obliterated, and we both were just lamenting the fact that like in every game we played against Shabalov, like he never released the tension ever. And like every game, there was just tension everywhere. And he would just build on it until you cracked. And it's like, not only is it hard just like in an objective chess sense, like for instance, like you're over the board and, Georg plays this rook d5 and you can kind of like understand that you're losing the d file and you have to try and find a solution to not cede this positional advantage. But like it's also really hard emotionally to play against someone who's like really comfortable just leaving the tension in a position. And it can be hard to deal with that. And that's one of the reasons why I think like club players just resolve it all the time, because it's like, okay, it's just easy to make a capture and then we can think after that or whatever. But again, like understand every single move is a positional transaction too. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope that in your future games or when you're studying chess or whatever, you start recognizing these moments of tension and building on the tension, trying to force positional mistakes and concessions from your opponents. All right, party people, Tony Rowe, out.